I was having trouble sleeping the other night. I had just finished another podcast, and my thoughts started towards what my next topic would be. I talk about success stories of things that happened before the internet, things that happened before this world-changing invention. In my half-asleep state, I started pondering the very nature of what I was doing. Podcasting, isn't that just talk radio before the internet? Some might say it is. I think so too. The only real difference is that podcasting is broadcasted over the internet, what you're doing right now. And talk radio is broadcast over the airwaves in AM, FM. In recent years, it has made its way over to satellite, and yes, you guessed it, the internet. Talk radio has spanned many a topic, just like podcasting. You have had talk radio about news, current events, music, history, comedy, film. The list goes on and on. Just like when you look up a topic for a new podcast you want to listen to. I listen to several podcasts, and they span just about every topic mentioned above. In fact, I still listen to talk radio. I guess I am of that generation. It all began on December 12th, 1901. Guglielmo Marconi transmitted a message across the Atlantic Ocean to Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, the closest point to Europe from North America. He used a 500-foot, 150-meter, kite-supported antenna for reception. The signals were transmitted by a high-powered station at Poldhu, Cornwall. From this began a journey of invention that led to broadcasting of all sorts of things like Morse code, spoken word, music, and yes, talk radio. Of course, we can't forget about cellular technology and Wi-Fi, but I'm getting ahead of myself. With things like social media, e-commerce, and the sharing economy, I think we forget what success looked like before the internet. That's what this podcast is all about. It's a bit of history, a bit nostalgia, and for some, perhaps a bit of a revelation. I hope you will enjoy it. So let's look at a success story on success before the internet. There was success before the internet, you know. We just forgot. Let's get started. Episode 2, Talk Radio. Welcome to the show. I want to thank you for listening. I hope to make this podcast educational, but also as entertaining as possible. Before I can get into how talk radio became so successful before the internet, I need to talk about how radio technology got its start and evolved to a point where it could be used as a transmission medium for things like talk radio. It's quite a journey. Let's begin. The invention of radio. There isn't just one person who invented radio. It was more like a puzzle whereby each piece was contributed by a different inventor, engineer, or physicist until the whole puzzle was complete. Or in this case, the basis for radio communication was created. Otherwise stated, the invention of radio communication was preceded by many decades of establishing theoretical underpinnings, discovery and experimental investigation of radio waves, and engineering and technical developments related to their transmission and detection. These developments allowed Guglielmo Marconi to turn radio waves into a wireless communication system. Now, my explanations might get a bit technical, but don't worry, I'll get to the good stuff. Wait a minute, isn't this all good stuff? Of course it is. Here we go. In an 1864 presentation, published in 1865, James Clerk Maxwell proposed theories of electromagnetism with mathematical proofs that showed that light and predicted that radio and X-rays were all types of electromagnetic waves were propagating through free space. Between 1886 and 1888, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz published the results of experiments wherein he was able to transmit electromagnetic waves, radio waves, through the air, proving Maxwell's electromagnetic theory. In other words, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz proved the existence of electromagnetic radiation. After the discovery, many scientists and inventors experimented with transmitting and detecting Hertzian waves. It would take almost 20 years for the term radio to be universally adopted for this type of electromagnetic radiation. Maxwell's theory, showing that light and Hertzian electromagnetic waves were the same phenomenon at different wavelengths, led Maxwellian scientists such as John Perry, Frederick Thomas Troughton, and Alexander Trotter to assume they would be analogous to optical light. Following Hertz's untimely death in 1894, British physicist and writer Oliver Lodge presented a widely covered lecture on Hertzian waves at the Royal Institution on June 1st of the same year. Lodge focused on the optical qualities of the waves and demonstrated how to transmit and detect them using an improved variation of French physicist Edouard Branly's detector lodge named the Coherer. That's a great name for either a song or a music album. Coherer. Lodge further expanded on Hertz's experiments showing how these new waves exhibited like light refraction, diffraction, polarization, interference, and standing waves, confirming that Hertz's waves and light waves were both forms of Maxwell's electromagnetic waves. During part of the demonstration, the waves were sent from the neighboring Clarendon Laboratory building and received by apparatus in the lecture theater. Basically, Oliver Lodge's 1894 lectures on Hertz demonstrated how to transmit and detect radio waves. After Lodge's demonstrations, researchers pushed their experiments further down the electromagnetic spectrum towards visible light to further explore the quasi-optical nature of these wavelengths. Oliver Lodge and Augusto Righi experimented with 1.5 and 12 gigahertz microwaves respectively, generated by small metal ball spark resonators. Russian physicist Peter Lebedev in 1895 conducted experiments in the 50 gigahertz range. Bengali Indian physicist Jagadish Chandra Bose conducted experiments at wavelengths of 60 gigahertz and invented waveguides, horn antennas, and semiconductor crystal detectors for use in his experiments. He would later write an essay, Adriza Alok, Invisible Light, on how in November 1895 he conducted a public demonstration at the Town Hall of Kolkata, India, using millimeter range wavelength microwaves to trigger detectors that ignited gunpowder and rang a bell in the distance. So, potential for communication, eh? Between 1890 and 1892, physicists such as John Perry, Frederick Thomas Troughton, and William Crookes proposed electromagnetic or Hertzian waves as a navigation aid or means of communication, with Crookes writing on the possibilities of wireless telegraphy based on Hertzian waves in 1892. Among physicists, what were perceived as technical limitations to using these new waves, such as delicate equipment, the need for large amounts of power to transmit over limited ranges, and its similarity to already existent optical light transmitting devices, led them to believe that applications were very limited. Serbian-American engineer Nikola Tesla considered Hertzian waves relatively useless for long-range transmission since light could not transmit further than the line of sight. There was speculation that this fog and stormy weather penetrating invisible light could be used in maritime applications, such as lighthouses. The London Journal, The Electrician, commented on Bose's achievements, saying, "We may in time see the whole system of coast lighting throughout the navigable world revolutionized by an Indian Bengali scientist working single-handedly in our Presidency College laboratory." In 1895, adapting the techniques presented in Lodge's published lectures, Russian physicist Alexander Stepanovich Popov built a lightning detector that used a coherer-based radio receiver. He presented it to the Russian Physical and Chemical Society on May 7, 1895. Let's talk about Marconi and radiotelegraphy. Born in 1874, Marconi was fascinated by the work of Heinrich Hertz, who had demonstrated the existence of electromagnetic waves. Building on Hertz's research, Marconi became determined to develop a practical system for wireless telegraphy, a means of transmitting messages without the need for wires. In 1894, the young Italian inventor began working on the idea of building a long-distance wireless transmission system based on the use of Hertzian waves, a line of inquiry that he noted other inventors did not seem to be pursuing. Marconi read through the literature and used the ideas of others who were experimenting with radio waves, but did a great deal to develop devices such as a portable transmitter and receiver systems that could work over long distance, turning what was essentially a laboratory experiment into a useful communication system. By August 1895, Marconi was field testing his system, but even with improvements, he was only able to transmit signals up to half a mile, a distance Oliver Lodge had predicted in 1894 as the maximum transmission distance for radio waves. Marconi raised the height of his antenna and hit upon the idea of grounding his transmitter and receiver. With these improvements, the system was capable of transmitting signals up to 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, and over hills. This apparatus proved to be the first engineering complete, commercially successful radio transmission system, and Marconi went on to receive British patent 12039, improvements in transmitting electrical impulses and signals, and in apparatus, therefore, in 1896. Nautical and transatlantic transmissions. In 1897, Marconi established a radio station on the Isle of Wight, England, and opened his wireless factory in the former Silk Works at Hall Street, Chelmsford, England, in 1898, employing around 60 people. As we talked at the beginning of the show, on December 12, 1901, using a 500-foot kite-supported antenna for reception, he transmitted signals by the company's new high-powered station at Poldhu, Cornwall. Marconi transmitted a message across the Atlantic Ocean to Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland. Marconi began to build high-powered stations on both sides of the Atlantic to communicate with ships at sea. In 1904, he established a commercial service to transmit nightly news summaries to subscribing ships, which could incorporate them into their on-board newspapers. A regular transatlantic radio telegraph service was finally begun on October 17, 1907, between Clifton, Ireland, and Glace Bay. But even after this, the company struggled for many years to provide reliable communication to others. Marconi's apparatus is also credited with saving the 700 people who survived the tragic Titanic disaster. Wow. All right, let's talk about transmitting audio. In the late 1890s, Canadian-American inventor Reginald Fessenden came to the conclusion that he could develop a far more efficient system than the spark gap transmitter and coherer receiver combination. To this end, he worked on developing a high-speed alternator referred to as an alternating current dynamo that generated pure sine waves and produced a continuous train of radiant waves of substantially uniform strength, or in modern terminology, a continuous wave transmitter. While working for the United States Weather Bureau on Cobb Island, Maryland, Fessenden researched using this setup for audio transmission via radio. By the fall of 1900, he successfully transmitted speech over a distance of about 1.6 kilometers, or a mile, which appears to have been the first successful audio transmission using radio signals. Although successful, the sound transmitted was far too distorted to be commercially practical. According to some sources, notably Fessenden's wife Helen's biography, on Christmas Eve 1906, Reginald used an Alexanderson alternator and rotary spark gap transmitter to make the first radio audio broadcast from Brant Rock, Massachusetts. Ships at sea heard a broadcast that included Fessenden playing "O Holy Night" on the violin and reading a passage from the Bible. Around the time, American inventor Lee DeForest experimented with an arc transmitter, which, unlike the discontinuous pulses produced by spark transmitters, created steady, continuous wave signal that could be used for amplitude-modulated AM audio transmission. In February 1907, he transmitted electronic telharmonium music from his laboratory station in New York City. This was followed by tests that included, in the fall, Eugenia Farah singing I Love You Truly. In July 1907, he made ship-to-shore transmissions by radio telephone. Race reports for the annual Interlakes Yachting Association regatta held on Lake Erie, which were sent from the steam yacht Thelma to his assistant Frank E. Butler, located in Fox Dock Pavilion on South Base Island. Broadcasting. This is good. We're getting to talk radio. Now we just have to talk more about the precursors to it. The Dutch company, Netherlandisch Radio Industrie, and its owner-engineer, Hanzo Izerda, made its first regular entertainment radio broadcast over the station PCGG from its workshop in The Hague on November 6, 1919. The company manufactured both transmitters and receivers. Its popular program was broadcast 4 nights a week using narrowband FM transmissions at 448 kilohertz until 1924, when the company ran into financial trouble. Regular entertainment broadcasts began in Argentina, pioneered by Enrico Telemaco Susini and his associates. On August 27, 1920, Sociedad Radio Argentina aired a live performance of Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal from the Coliseo Theater in downtown Buenos Aires. Only about 20 homes in the city had receivers to tune into this program. On August 31, 1920, the Detroit News began publicized daily news and entertainment, Detroit News Radiophone broadcasts, originally as licensed amateur station 8MK, then later as WBW and WWJ in Detroit, Michigan. Union College in Schenectady, New York began broadcasting on October 14, 1920, over 2ADD, an amateur station licensed to Wendell King, an African-American student at the school. Broadcasts included a series of Thursday night concerts initially heard within a 100-mile radius and later for a 1,000-mile radius. In 1922, regular audio broadcasts for entertainment began in the UK from the Marconi Research Centre 2MT at Riddle near Chelmsford, England. All right, let's talk about wavelength and frequency. In early radio, and to a limited extent much later, the transmission signal of radio stations was specified in meters, referring to the wavelength, the length of the radio wave. This is the origin from the term long wave, medium wave, and short wave radio. Portions of the radio spectrum reserved for specific purposes were often referred to by wavelength. The 40-meter band was used for amateur radio. For example, the relation between wavelength and frequency is reciprocal. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wave, and vice versa. As equipment progressed, precise frequency control became possible. Early stations often did not have a precise frequency, as it was affected by the temperature of the equipment, among other factors. Identifying a radio signal by its frequency rather than its length proved much more practical and useful, and started in the 1920s. This became the usual method of identifying signal, especially in the United States. Frequency specified in the number of cycles per second, kilocycles, megacycles, were replaced by the more specific designation of hertz, cycles per second, around 1965. Radio companies. British Marconi. Using various patents, the British Marconi Company was established in 1897 by Guglielmo Marconi and began communication between coast radio stations and ships at sea. A year after, in 1898, they successfully introduced their first radio station in Chelmsford. This company, along with its subsidiaries in Canada, Marconi and American Marconi, had a stranglehold on ship-to-shore communication. It operated much the way American Telephone and Telegraph operated until 1983, owning all of its equipment and refusing to communicate with non-Marconi-equipped ships. Many inventions improved the quality of radio, and amateurs experimented with the uses of radio, thus planting the first seeds of broadcasting. Telefunken. The company Telefunken was founded on May 27, 1903 as Telefunken Society for Wireless Telephone of Siemens and Halske, and the Allgemeine Elektrostats Gesellschaft, General Electric Company. I hope I didn't butcher it too bad. As joint undertakings for radio engineering in Berlin. It continued as a joint venture of AEG and Siemens AG until Siemens left in 1941. In 1911, Kaiser Wilhelm II sent Telefunken engineers to West Sayville, New York, to erect 3 600-foot radio towers there. Nikola Tesla assisted in the construction. A similar station was erected in Nauen, creating only wireless communication between North America and Europe. Technological development. Amplitude modulated, AM. The invention of amplitude modulated radio, which allows more closely spaced stations to simultaneously send signals as opposed to the spark gap radio, where each transmission occupies a wide bandwidth, is attributed to Reginald Fessenden, Valdemar Poulsen, and Lee DeForest. Crystal set receivers. In the 1920s, the United States government publication Construction and Operation of a Simple Homemade Radio Receiving Outfit showed how almost any person handy with simple tools could build an effective crystal radio receiver. The most common type of receiver for vacuum tubes was the crystal set, although some early radios used some type of amplification through electric current or battery. Inventions of the triode amplifier, motor generator, and detector enabled audio radio. The use of amplitude modulation, by which sound waves can be transmitted over a continuous wave radio signal of narrow bandwidth as opposed to the spark gap, which sent rapid strings of damped wave pulses that consumed much bandwidth and were only suitable for Morse code telegraphy, was pioneered by Fessenden, Poulsen, and Lee DeForest. The art and science of crystal sets is still pursued as a hobby in the form of simple unamplified radios that runs on nothing forever. They are used as teaching tools by groups such as the Boy Scouts of America to introduce youngsters to electronics and radio, as the only energy available is that's gathered by the antenna system. Loudness is necessarily limited. Vacuum tubes, not just for vintage guitar amps. The first commercial AM Audion vacuum tube transmitter was built in 1914 by Lee DeForest, who invented the Audion triode in 1906. During the mid-1920s, amplifying vacuum tubes revolutionized radio receivers and transmitters. John Ambrose Fleming developed a vacuum tube diode. Lee DeForest placed a screen, added a grid electrode, creating the triode. Early radios ran the entire power of the transmitter through a carbon microphone. In the 1920s, the Westinghouse Company bought Lee DeForest and Edwin Armstrong's patent. During the mid-1920s, amplifying vacuum tubes revolutionized radio receivers and transmitters. Westinghouse engineers developed a more modern vacuum tube. The first radio still required batteries, but in 1926, the battery eliminator was introduced to the market. This tube technology allowed radios to be powered through the grid instead. They still required batteries to heat up the vacuum tube filaments, but after the invention of indirectly heated vacuum tubes, the first completely battery-free radios became available in 1927. In 1929, a new screen grid tube called the UY224 was introduced, an amplifier designed to operate directly on alternating current. A problem with the early radios was fading stations and fluctuating volume. The invention of the superheterodyne receiver solved this problem, and the first radios with heterodyne radio receiver went for sale in 1924. But it was costly, and the technology was shelved while waiting for the technology to mature. And in 1929, the Radiola 66 and the Radiola 67 went for sale. Loudspeakers, also not just for vintage guitar amps. In the early days, one had to use headphones to listen to the radio. Later, loudspeakers in the form of a horn, of the type used by phonographs, equipped with a telephone receiver, became available. But the sound quality was poor. In 1926, the first radios with electrodynamic loudspeakers went for sale, which improved the quality a lot. At first, the loudspeakers were separated from the radio, but soon, radios would come with a built-in loudspeaker. Other inventions related to sound was the automatic volume control, first commercially available in 1928. In 1930, a tone control knob was added to the radios. This allowed listeners to improve imperfect broadcasting. The magnetic cartridge, which was introduced in the mid-20s, greatly improved the broadcasting of music. When playing music from a phonograph before the magnetic cartridge, a microphone had to be placed close to a horn speaker. The invention allowed the electrical signals to be amplified and then fed directly to the broadcast transmitter. All right, transistor technology. I'm not going to say it unless you played guitar in the 1980s. The Regency TR-1, which used Texas Instruments NPN transistors, was the world's first commercially produced transistor radio in 1954. Following development of transistor technology, bipolar junction transistors led to the development of the transistor radio. In 1954, the Regency Company introduced a pocket transistor radio, the TR-1, powered by a standard 22.5 volt battery. In 1955, the newly formed Sony Company introduced its first transistorized radio, the TR-55. It was small enough to fit in a vest pocket, powered by a small battery. It was durable because it had no vacuum tubes to burn out. In 1957, Sony introduced the TR-63, the first mass-produced transistor radio, leading to the mass market penetration of transistor radios. Over the next 20 years, transistors replaced tubes almost completely except for high-powered transmitters. By the mid-1960s, the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, were using metal oxide semiconductor-filled effect transistors, or MOSFETs, in their consumer products, including FM radio, television, and amplifiers. Metal oxide semiconductor, MOS, large-scale integration, provided a practical and economic solution for radio technology and was used in mobile radio systems by the early 1970s. Integrated circuit. The first integrated circuit radio, P1740, by General Electric, became available in 1966. Now we're getting to FM. In 1933, FM radio was patented by inventor Edwin H. Armstrong. FM uses frequency modulation of the radio wave to reduce static and interference from electrical equipment and the atmosphere. In 1937, W1XOJ, the first experimental FM radio station after Armstrong's W2XMN in Alpine, New Jersey, was granted a construction permit by the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. FM in Europe. After World War II, FM radio broadcasting was introduced in Germany. At a meeting in Copenhagen in 1948, a new wavelength plan was set up for Europe. Because of the recent war, Germany, which did not exist as a state and so was not invited, was only given a small number of medium wave frequencies which were not very good for broadcasting. For this reason, Germany began broadcasting on UKW, Ultra Kurzwelle, i.e. ultra short wave. Of course, today we call it VHF, which was not covered by the Copenhagen Plan. After some amplitude modulation experience with VHF, it was realized that FM radio was much better alternative for VH radio than AM. Because of this history, FM radio is still referred to as UKW radio in Germany. Other European nations followed a bit later, when the superior sound quality of FM and the ability to run many more local stations because of the more limited range of VHF broadcasts were realized. Okay, now that we set the stage, so to speak, we can talk about how talk radio evolved in the 20th century from technology that actually began in the 19th century. Let's go. Talk radio. Talk radio was a radio format containing discussion about topical issues and consisting entirely or almost entirely of original spoken word content rather than outside music. They may feature monologues, dialogues between the hosts, interviews with guests, and or listener participation, which may be live conversations between the host and listeners who, quote-unquote, call in, usually via telephone, or via voicemail. Listener contributions are usually screened by a show's producers to maximize audience interest and, in the case of commercial talk radio, to attract advertisers. Talk shows and commercial stations are organized into segments, each separated by a pause for advertisements. However, in public or non-commercial radio, music is sometimes played in place of commercials to separate the program segments. Variations of talk radio include conservative talk, hot talk, liberal talk, increasingly known as progressive talk, and sports talk. While talk radio has historically been associated with broadcast radio starting around 2005, the technology for internet-based talk radio shows became cost-effective in the form of live internet websites, streaming, and podcasts. Now, an individual can use a variety of services to host an internet-based talk show without carriage by a traditional radio. Also, TV programming from talk and news outlets such as BBC, CNN, Bloomberg, and Fox are now often available, expanding the world of talk radio further. Talk radio listening is enjoyed not only on radios, but a wide variety of other devices and services, including PCs, using iTunes, station directors such as TuneIn, show directory smartphones with apps such as Stitcher, and time-shifting services like dar.fm. There is talk radio in practically every corner of the world. I will only talk about the main players, namely the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and Spain, but I will leave info in the show notes so you can explore in more detail all the types and geographic locations of talk radio. Oddly enough, there's not a lot of info out there about the history of talk radio. You would figure something that is almost 100 years old would have more. I'd love to hear from any listeners that have some links to give about the kinds of talk radio and what's out there. Okay, let's talk about talk radio. The United States. Talk radio is most popular on the AM band, non-commercial, usually referred to as public radio, which is mainly located in a reserved spectrum of the FM band, also broadcast talk programs. Commercial all-talk stations can be found on the FM band in many cities across the U.S. These shows often relied less on political discussion and analysis than their AM counterparts and often employ the use of pranks and bits for entertainment purposes. In the United States and Canada, satellite radio services offered uncensored, freewheeling original programming. ABC News and Talk is an example of the repackaging for the digital airwaves shows featured on their terrestrial radio stations. All right, let's talk a little about the history. Expressing and debating political opinions has been a staple of radio since the medium's infancy. Amy Semple McPherson began her radio broadcasts in the early 1920s and even purchased her station, KFSG, which went on the air in February 1924. By the mid-1930s, controversial radio priest Father Charles Coughlin's radio broadcasts were reaching millions per week. There was also a national current events forum called America's Town Meeting of the Air, which broadcast once a week starting in 1935. It featured panel discussions from some of the biggest newsmakers and was among the first shows to allow audience participation. Members of the studio audience would question guests or even heckle them. All right, let's really go back to the beginning. Talk radio as a listener participation format has existed since the 1930s. John J. Anthony was an announcer and DJ on New York's WMRJ. It was in the America Radio Store at 12 New York Boulevard in Jamaica, Long Island. After some marital troubles, refusing to pay alimony and child support, he sought professional help and began his radio series where listeners would call in with their problems in 1930. Radio historians considered this the first instance of talk radio. While working for New York's WMCA in 1945, Barry Gray was bored with playing music and put a telephone receiver up to his microphone to talk to bandleader Woody Herman. This was soon followed by listener call-ins, and Gray is often billed as the hot mama of talk radio. Herb Jepko was another pioneer. Author Bill Cherry proposed George Roy Clow as the first to invite listeners to argue politics on a call-in radio show at KLUF, his station in Galveston, Texas, to bring his political views into listeners' homes. He later became the mayor of Galveston. Cherry gives no specific date, but the context of events in history of the station would seem to place it also in the 1940s, perhaps earlier. The format was the classic mode in which the announcer gave the topic for the day and listeners called in to debate the issue. In 1948, Alan Courtney, New York disc jockey and co-composer of the popular song Joltin' Joe DiMaggio, began a call-in program for the Storer station in Miami, Florida, WGBS, and then on Miami's WQAM, WINZ, and WCKR. The Alan Courtney Open Phone Forum flourished as an avowedly conservative and anti-communist political forum with a coverage area over the southeastern U.S. and Cuba. Joe Pye, John Neville, Gene Shepard, and Jerry Williams, WMEX in Boston, were among the first to explore the medium in the 1950s. A breakthrough in talk radio occurred in 1960 at KLAC in Los Angeles. Alan Henry, a broadcaster in his early 30s, had been hired by John Kluge, president of Metro Media, in 1963. Henry had previously worked in such diverse markets as Miami, Florida, Waterloo, Iowa, Hartford, Connecticut, and St. Louis, Missouri. KLAC was dead last in the ratings, but Kluge wanted a big Metro Media presence in Los Angeles. He sent Henry from New York to Los Angeles to turn KLAC into a success. The first thing that Henry did was hire the legendary morning team of Lohman and Barkley. Henry had built a strong relationship with programmer Jim Lightfoot, who had joined Henry in Miami. A unique opportunity presented itself when Joe Pine, who had begun his career as a radio talk personality in Pennsylvania, was fired by KABC in Los Angeles. The speculation was that Pine was too controversial and confrontational for the ABC corporate culture. Henry hired Pine on the spot and paid him $25,000 a year, which was a huge salary for a radio personality. Pine was given the night show on KLAC. Part of the agreement with Pine was that Henry and Lightfoot would give him broad control over his program content. The show was an immediate success. Henry encouraged the confrontation with listeners and guests, for which Pine became famous. Pine coined the line, "Go gargle with razor blades," for guests with whom he disagreed. The Pine Show was the beginning of the confrontational talk format that later spread across the radio spectrum. At one point in the 1960s, the Joe Pine Show was syndicated on over 250 radio stations in the United States. In an odd turn of events, Pine's radio show led him to television. Henry suggested to John Kluge that Joe Pine should be put on Metro Media's newly acquired TV station in Los Angeles, KTTV. Kluge told Henry to speak to KTTV's general manager, Al Criven, but Henry had already done that, and Criven had adamantly refused. Kluge telephoned Criven, and Pine soon became the nation's first controversial late-night talk show television host. The Joe Pine Show on KTTV quickly shot up to the top of the ratings. The format later proliferated on cable television with a variety of new hosts, many of them taking on similar personas to Joe Pine. Joe Pine and Alan Henry were major factors in establishing a new trend in radio and television programming. Alan Henry elaborates on the launching of the Joe Pine on KLAC Radio and KTTV in his memoir, A Man in His Medium. Two radio stations, KMOX 1120 AM in St. Louis, Missouri, and KABC 790 AM in Los Angeles, adopted an all-talk show format in 1960, and both claimed to be the first to have done so. KABC station manager Ben Hoberman and KMOX station manager Robert Hyland independently developed the all-talk format. KTKK 630 AM in Salt Lake City, then known as KSXX, adopted a full-time talk schedule in 1965 and is the third station in the country to have done so. KSXX started with an all-local talent, and KTKK, which now airs at 6:40 a.m., has a larger portion of its schedule featuring local talent than most other stations that run a full schedule of talk. In the 1970s and early 1980s, as many listeners abandoned AM music formats for the high-fidelity sound of FM radio, the talk radio format began to catch on in larger cities. Former music stations all over the country made the switch to all talk as their ratings slumped due to listener migration to the FM band. Since the turn of the 21st century, with many music listeners now migrating to digital platforms such as Pandora Radio, SiriusXM, and the numerous variations of the iPod, talk radio has been expanding on the FM side of the dial as well. Now, wouldn't be right if we left out shock jocks and their hot takes on the radio dial. Hot talk, also called FM talk or shock talk, is a talk radio format geared predominantly to a male demographic between the ages of 18 and 49. It generally consists of pop culture subjects on FM radio rather than the political talk found on the AM dial. Hosts of hot talk shows are usually known as shock jocks. Clear Channel Communications, which became iHeartMedia in 2015, has a select few hot talk stations under the moniker Real Radio, while CBS Radio once had a larger chain of hot talkers known as Free FM, though the brand was abandoned after a post-Howard Stern attempt to network the format failed within a year. It is usually found on FM radio rock, classic rock, and country stations in morning drive, as the actual hot talk formatted stations have only achieved mediocre success compared to AM or conservative talk radio or even FM music radio. It is also effectively a format that is unviable due to an average workday in North America, due to the format's tendency to discuss topics wholly inappropriate for a workplace setting, and outside of discussions of attractiveness, entirely repels women as regular listeners. In March 2018, CBS Radio's corporate successor, Entercom, now Audacity Incorporated, entitled a hot talk format in San Diego with KEGY 97.3 The Machine. It featured a weekday lineup devoted to hot talk programs, blocks of classical rock interspersed with comedy bits during off-peak hours, and coverage of San Diego Padres baseball. However, the station attracted controversy later that month when an advertisement for the station's forthcoming morning show, Kevin Kline Live, which invited listeners to jump to a new morning show, accompanied by a picture of the Coronado Bridge, was criticized for glorifying suicide by bridge jumping. The ensuing controversy prompted the Padres to scrutinize KEGY's direction. Executive Ron Fowler voiced concerns over the team being associated with KEGY's shock jock content, threatening to possibly cut ties with the station and Entercom. Kevin Kline's program never premiered, and the hot talk format was ultimately dropped on April 12, 2018, in favor of the conventional sports format as 97.3 The Fan. In 2019, JVC Media began to establish a hot talk network in Florida branded as Florida Man Radio, in reference to the Florida Man internet meme. Beginning with WDYZ in Orlando, the network has picked up personalities such as Shannon Burke and Ed Tile, with the syndicated Bubba the Love Sponge serving as its morning show. In 2022, after receiving the station in a trade from Audacity, Beasley Broadcast Group's KXTE in Las Vegas shifted to a hot talk format for its weekday lineup, which consists primarily of syndicated morning shows, including Dave and Mahoney, for which it is the flagship station, as well as Free Beer and Hot Wings and Dave and Chuck the Freak from sister WRIF in Detroit. The genre has also shown up on satellite radio and in podcasting, which typically have more creative freedom due to the lack of indecency rules and lower reliance on corporate advertising. Other U.S. hosts specialize in talk radio comedy, such as Phil Hendry, who voices his fictional guests and occasionally does parodies of other programs. Of course, no podcast would be complete without talking about political talk radio in America. The United States saw dramatic growth in the popularity of talk radio during the 1990s due to the repeal of the Federal Communications Commission's post-war Fairness Doctrine of 1949. In 1987, the mandate of the Fairness Doctrine was to require that audiences were exposed to a diversity of viewpoints. It had required the holders of the broadcast licenses to present controversial issues of public importance and to do so in a manner that was, in the Commission's view, honest, equitable, and balanced. Its repeal provided an opportunity for a kind of partisan political programming with commercial appeal that had not previously existed. The most successful pioneer in the early 1990s talk radio movement in the U.S. was the politically conservative commentator Rush Limbaugh. Limbaugh's success demonstrated that there was a nationwide market for a passionately delivered conservative polemic on contemporary news, events, and social trends, and changed the face of how the talk radio business was conducted. Unrestrained by the Fairness Doctrine, cheering for one's political party, and especially against the other, had become popular entertainment which rapidly changed the way politics nationally was discussed, perceived, and conducted. Other radio talk show hosts who describe themselves as either conservative or libertarian have also had success as nationally syndicated hosts, including Hugh Hewitt, Sean Hannity, John Arthur, Glenn Beck, Michael Medved, Laura Ingraham, Neil Boritz, Michael Savage, Bill O'Reilly, Larry Gators, and Mark Levin. The Salem Radio Syndicates, a group of religiously oriented Republican activists including evangelical Christian Hugh Hewitt and Jewish conservatives Dennis Prager and Michael Medved. These are mostly distributed in the 24-hour news format among Salem stations, and they generally earn ratings much less than their syndicated counterparts. In the summer of 2007, conservative talk show hosts mobilized public opposition to the McCain-Kennedy immigration reform bill, which eventually failed. Conservative hosts Limbaugh, Ingraham, Bennett, Prager, Hannity, Beck, Levin, and Hewitt coalesced around endorsing former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney for president at the end of January 2008, after Fred Thompson, the described favorite of some of the hosts, dropped out, to oppose the nomination of Senator John McCain. However, Romney suspended his campaign in February of the same year and endorsed McCain. During the primaries, Limbaugh had endorsed a plan to do whatever it took to prolong the Democrats' nomination by encouraging political conservatives to cross over to the Democrats and voting for the trailing candidate, a plan called Operation Chaos. Conservative talk show hosts also lent their unified support for congressional candidate Doug Hoffman, a conservative third-party candidate who was running in the New York's 23rd Congressional District special election in 2009 against the liberal Republican Deidre Scozzavava and a mainstream Democrat, Bill Owens. The unified support from the conservative base helped propel Hoffman to frontrunner status and effectively killed the Scozzavava's campaign, forcing her to drop out of the race several days before the election. This effort backfired on the conservative hosts as Democrat candidate Owens won in part thanks to Scozzavava's endorsement of Owens. Local hosts such as Los Angeles' John and Ken have also proven effective in influencing the political landscape. Libertarians like Dennis Miller, based in Los Angeles, John Arthur, host of John Arthur Live, based in Florida, and Patty Brooks, KGMI, based in the Pacific Northwest, have also achieved some success. Many of these hosts also publish books, write newspaper columns, appear on television, and give public lectures. Politically liberal talk radio aimed at a national audience has also emerged in the mid-2000s. Air America, a network featuring The Al Franken Show, was founded in 2004. It billed itself as a progressive alternative to conservative talk radio shows. Some prominent examples of liberal talk radio shows, either previously or currently in national syndication, include Dial Global Talk Show hosts Ed Schultz, Tom Hartman, Bill Press, and Norman Goldman. Goldman began as a high-rating fill-in host and senior legal analyst for Ed Schultz before launching his own show, The Young Turks. Clear Channel iHeartMedia, with nearly 1,300 radio stations under its ownership, along with other owners, has in recent years added more liberal talk stations to their portfolio. These have primarily come from the conversion of AM facilities, most of which formerly had adult standard formats. Many complaints, all radio stations are required by the FCC to maintain in their public files copies of all correspondence from the public relating to station operations, for a period of 3 years from receipt have been received from fans of this musical genre. Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, big band music, etc. But the left-leaning talk programming leans towards a much younger demographic, a group that advertisers covet. More recently, however, Clear Channel has been dropping liberal formats in favor of their own Fox Sports Radio network. By 2014, most liberal talk stations had abandoned the format, forcing hosts to find other ways to distribute their programming. Liberal opinion radio has long existed on the Pacifica network, though only available in a small number of major cities and in formats that more often act as volunteer-run community forums than a platform for charismatic hosts who would be likely to attract a large audience. The one major host to become popular on the network is Amy Goodman, whose Democracy Now! Interview and journalism program is broadcast nationwide. Conservative critics have long complained that the long-format news programming on National Public Radio, NPR, shows a liberal bias, although this was disputed once in 2004 by the Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, a progressive media criticism organization which found that, for example, representatives of think tanks to the right of center outnumbered those to the left of center by more than 4-1, 62 appearances to 15. National Public Radio itself denies any partisan agenda. Politically oriented talk programs on the network are in the mold of Talk of the Nation, which was designed to be a soundboard for the varied opinions of listeners. While politically oriented talk is still heard on the AM dial, mostly the conservative format, it has seen some expanding onto the FM dial. One notable example was WPGB in Pittsburgh, which switched to a talk format in 2004 after years of having several different music formats, branding itself as FM News Talk 104.7 due to the relative uncommonness of politically oriented talk on the FM side of the dial, even in 2013 while FM talk in general has expanded. Owned by Clear Channel and stylized as one of Clear Channel's typical conservative-leaning AM talk stations, WPGP's ratings were steadily high during its time as a talk station, whereas the station's numerous music formats were among the lowest in the Pittsburgh market before switching. Clear Channel, which owns WPGB, has shifted some of their talk stations from full-powered FM signals to lower-range transistor stations which use AM or HD radio subchannel stations to originate those broadcasts. WPGB fired its morning show in December 2013 and has switched back to music in August 2014, selling the format rights to AM station to WJAS. All right, let's talk personalities in talk radio. There have been some precursors for talk radio show stars, such as the Los Angeles area controversial Joe Pine, who would attack callers on his program in the early 1960s. One of his famous insults was to go gargle with razor blades. We mentioned that earlier. Talk radio also included personal relationship consultants such as Laura Schlesinger and Barbara DeAngelis, both heard on KFI AM in Los Angeles. Host Larry Elder on KABC AM was a lawyer before entering the talk radio market. Leah Laporte offers consumer computer advice. Business and real estate advice shows, paid health supplement presentations, and religious programs are widely available. Paranormal radio shows have had a place on radio for several decades. While the format has never been successful on a full-time basis, it has proven popular in the overnight graveyard slot. Long John Neville's program was one of the first to devote itself to the concept before it was further fleshed out by Art Bell, whose Coast to Coast AM went on to have comparable popularity to daytime talk show hosts of his era. Bell had a long-running on and off relationship with the show he founded, often leaving the show and returning on an erratic basis, also starting up new shows such as Dreamland, Art Bell's Dark Matter, and Midnight in the Desert, only to quit them a few weeks into their run. Bell died in 2018. Coast to Coast AM continues with George Noory as permanent lead host, with a rotating host on weekends. Clyde Lewis and Jason Hawes also host nationally syndicated paranormal shows. Sports. Sports talk radio can be found locally and nationally in the U.S. As of 2013, 5 national full-time sports talk networks exist. The oldest existing network, dating to 1991, is SportsMap, although it has only been branded as such since 2020, and has rebranded frequently over the years. Market leader ESPN Radio followed shortly thereafter in 1992, followed by Fox Sports Radio about 2000. And the near concurrent series of CBS Sports Radio and NBC Sports Radio in late 2012 and early 2013. Most of these, however, are on weak, low-budget AM stations. The most successful sports talk stations have operated primarily with local programs and supplement their programming with the broadcasting of sports events usually involving the local teams in the major professional sports leagues. This adds significant expense to the station's operations and must be balanced carefully with the regular talk schedule, as an incendiary review about the team by a host can lead to that team pulling their broadcast from the station. Local stations may also hire personalities with polarizing opinions about sports topics and athletes to make some kind of national impact that might turn off listeners, and on large markets, sports talk stations may be made up of personalities who pay stations for their showtime and their advertising, disallowing any natural flow between each program, along with in-station competitions about whose show has the most impact. Ratings. Pew researchers found in 2004 that 17% of the public regularly listen to talk radio. This audience is mostly male, middle-aged, and conservative. Among those who regularly listen to talk radio, 41% are Republican and 28% are Democrats. Furthermore, 45% describe themselves as conservatives, compared with 18% who say they are progressive liberals. In 2011, the Arbitron Portable People Meter rating system compiled data suggesting that out of 11 nationally rated radio formats, talk radio had lost nearly the most market share and ratings continued to slide. In 2013, Arbitron's executive summary noted that 92% of consumers aged 12 years and older listen to the radio once a week, and news talk information and talk personality remain number 1 in PPM markets and number 2 in the rest of the U.S. Some of the most listened to radio programs in the United States are talk radio shows or have talk radio elements like The Sean Hannity Show and All Things Considered. All right, now that we talked about talk radio in the United States, let's take a small break, and then we'll talk about it in the other hotspots in the world. Talk radio in Canada. Okay, let's talk a little bit where I come from. In contrast to talk radio stations in the United States, where syndicated programs tend to make up a significant part of most schedules, privately owned Canadian talk radio stations tend to be predominantly local in programming and focus. There is no Canadian content requirement for talk radio or spoken word programming unless the individual station license expressly stipulates such a requirement. Most do not. In Canada, prospective radio stations may propose certain restrictions on their license to gain favor with the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission and have an easier time obtaining a license. I would suggest you check out an Alan Cross podcast called The History of New Music. It actually started in the early 90s as a radio show. I used to listen to it all the time on Sunday nights. But now he has a podcast, which you can find pretty much anywhere you find your podcasts. How about you check out his episode on the Canadian content laws? It's for music, but it's really a good one. I'll leave some information in the show notes. Okay. The most recent nationally syndicated, politically oriented weekday talk show in Canada was the Charles Adler Tonight, hosted by Charles Adler and heard on 11 stations across the country. After 5 years, the show ended in August 2021. Until 2006, Peter Warren's Warren on the Weekend was heard Saturdays and Sundays. Both programs are or were distributed by the Chorus Radio Network, and coincidentally, both hosts had hosted different morning call-in shows in the same time slot in Winnipeg, Manitoba's CJOB 680 before they became nationally syndicated. Alder's show originated from CJOB and retained its original title, while Warren was based in Victoria, British Columbia. Before Charles Adler Tonight, Chorus had syndicated Rutherford, hosted by conservative Dave Rutherford and originating from its Calgary station CHQR. Rutherford is no longer syndicated nationally but continues to air in Calgary, Edmonton, and London. Other Canadian talk radio programs, which have been syndicated to different markets, include The George Stroumboulopoulos Show. It airs Sunday nights on stations in Toronto and Montreal. The Home Discovery Show, a call-in home renovation program hosted by Shel Busey. Love and Romance, a relationship advice program hosted by Sue McGarvey. Primetime Sports, a sports talk program hosted by Bob McCown. A 3-hour program originating from CJCL. Usually only the third hour is broadcast nationally. Renovations Across Canada, a weekend program about home renovations hosted by Ren Molnar. It is the most widely distributed talk radio program in Canada. The Roy Green Show, a political and entertainment-based show hosted by Roy Green that airs on Saturday and Sunday afternoons, primarily on the Chorus Radio Network. I remember when that used to broadcast on my local AM station. I used to actually listen to it quite a bit. But I kind of don't now. All right, and The X Zone, a nightly show about paranormal topics hosted by Rob McConnell. It is also syndicated throughout the United States. The two largest talk radio networks in Canada are publicly owned Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's English language, CBC Radio 1, and French language, EC Radio Canada Premiere. These stations typically produce their local morning and afternoon programs and regional noon-hour programs to go along with the network programming that is aired during the rest of the day. Both networks are commercial-free. CBC Radio 1's flagship national talk program is the Weekend Cross Country Checkup, which has been in broadcast since 1965. CFRA 580 AM in Ottawa, formerly part of the Chum Network, which is now part of CTV, has a large and dedicated listening audience. The station is heard throughout the Ottawa Valley and on the internet. Several key programs focus on local, political, and world issues. Privately owned talk radio syndication networks in Canada are generally formed to share programs across a group of stations with common ownership, although some are formed to distribute their one or two talk radio programs to several stations regardless of ownership. The largest one of these is the Chorus Radio Network. TSN Radio, the successor to the long-defunct The Team, is one of the newest national networks in Canada, with operations in several major markets. Syndicated programs from the United States, which air on Canadian radio stations, are typically non-political shows such as the Kim Commando Show and Coast to Coast AM, as well as sports radio shows from the 24-hour networks in the U.S. Traditionally, political-driven talk radio from the U.S. states does not air on Canadian stations, with a few scattered exceptions. For example, the now-defunct CFBN, which carried political programming such as the Glenn Beck program and Dennis Miller, and the also discontinued talk format of CHAM, which carried Miller. Top political programs such as the Rush Limbaugh Show are never broadcast on Canadian stations, mainly due to high rights fees compared to their relevance to non-American audiences. American stations near the Canadian border can provide many Canadians with access to American talk programs. The signals of Limbaugh affiliates WJR, WBEN, and WHAM, for example, cover almost all of southern Ontario. Local talk radio plays a significant role in the politics of Newfoundland and Labrador. Political parties have systematically coordinated call-ins by members of the House of the Assembly when public opinion pollsters are known to be in the field. The provincial government routinely purchases transcripts of these calls. All right, talk radio in the United Kingdom. Talk radio in the United Kingdom is popular, though not as much as music radio. Nationwide talk stations include BBC Radio 4, BBC Radio 5 Live, BBC Radio 4 Extra, Talk Radio, Talk Sport, and Times Radio. Regional stations include BBC Radio Scotland and BBC Radio Wales. Many BBC local radio stations and some commercial stations offer a talk format. For example, BBC Radio London, the BBC's flagship local station. Other notable commercial talk stations include London's LBC, which pioneered news talk format in Europe. LBC currently operates two services: LBC, a news talk station on FM London and via several digital platforms nationally, including DAB and Freeview, and LBC News, a rolling news station on AM in London and DAB Plus nationally. There are many specialist talk services such as Bloomberg, a financial news station, and Asia Radio Live. Talk radio expanded dramatically when the BBC's monopoly on radio broadcasting ended in the 1970s with the launch of independent local radio. Some notable British talk radio presenters include Jenny Murray, John Humphreys, Martha Kearney, Jonathan Dimbley, Libby Purves, Laurie Taylor, Pam Ayres, to name a few. Pete Price on City Talk is also known as the DJ who rushed to the aid of a regular caller who died live on air during a call. Previously, he had kept the teenager talking for 45 minutes before meeting him to convince him not to commit suicide. Wow. In Australia, talk radio is known as talkback radio. The most popular talkback radio station historically was Sydney's 2UE, whose populous programs like the John Laws Morning Show were widely syndicated across the continent. In recent years, though, 2UE has been eclipsed by its Sydney's rival, 2GB, after the defection of 2UE's most popular talkback host, Alan Jones. As a result, 2UE, and owned by the same company as 2GB, abandoned most of its rigid political and hot topic-driven talkback programming in 2016, moving to a less serious lifestyle and branded content format, although still remaining a talkback element. Melbourne 3AW is the highest rating talkback radio show and has also been the highest rating Melbourne radio station for several decades in a row. 6PR personality Gary Meadows was the first announcer to use talkback radio in early 1967. Talkback radio, using a 7-second time-lapse mechanism, began in Australia in April 1967, simultaneously on 2SM Sydney with Mike Walsh and 3DV Melbourne with Barry Jones. In the 1990s and 2000s, talkback on FM was attempted. The Spoon Man was a program hosted by Brian Carlton on the Triple M network in the late 1990s and returned in 2005 for 3.5 years, the show wrapping up in 2008. It was a show that covered many topics, but the hot talk format in the U.S. would probably be the best way to describe the program. Talkback radio has historically been an important political forum in Australia and functions much like the cable news televisions in the United States, with live and saturated coverage of political issues. Spain. Talk radio in Spain is very popular, where the most important radio stations are exclusively dedicated to talk shows such as Cadena Ser, Cadena Cope, Onda Cero, Radio Nacional, or Punto Radio. There is a very wide variety of topics such as politics, sport, comedy, and culture. Sports talk shows are particularly relevant since football attracts a massive interest in Spain, with a special focus on FC Barcelona and Real Madrid CF, and the men's national football team. Typically, the programming of a main talk show stations is modified whenever there's a major football event, such as a La Liga or a national team event. Daily late-night sport talk shows are also very relevant, with a very intense competition between the radio stations in this time slot, which typically starts around midnight. Comedy morning talk shows are also very popular in music radio stations, 40 Principales M80 Radio, Europa FM, and others, where there is strong competition since it is also a very important time slot, when typically people going to the workplace listen to the radio in their cars early in the morning, around 7 or 8 a.m. As Spain has a large English-speaking communities from many different countries, it is a natural place for English-language talk radio broadcasting. The first talk radio station in English was Coastline Radio, broadcasting from Neria, Costa del Sol. It is now a music station. A group of English expats set up OCI International in the early 1990s. Based in Marbella on the Costa del Sol, it was owned by the once national Spanish network. It provided a link for the English-speaking expats living on the coast, as well as some content for Scandinavian expats. OCI was closed in 2007 to make way for Radio Europa Music. In 2004, REM-FM began broadcasting, with shows mostly fronted by former OCI presenters. The station closed in 2008. In 2008, Talk Radio Europe began broadcasting. It offers a 24-hour schedule of news, interviews, discussion, and debate, and is a world media partner with BBC World Service and is affiliated to IRN Sky News. Talk Radio Europe broadcasts in FM on the Costa del Sol, Costa Elmira, Costa Blanca, and across the island of Mallorca in English. It is available on the internet and all smartphone platforms. All right, now that I've spoken about talk radio, let's talk about the differences between it and podcasting. The major difference I can see is that, well, I'm sure you can see it too. Talk radio is live, unless it's a rebroadcast, and podcasting is on demand. That's not true, actually. Podcasting can be live as well, as a stream, like Facebook Live or a YouTube live stream, although this is rarer. They can call in like a radio show too. As I mentioned before, the topics span everything you can imagine, from history, music, movies, sports, politics, entertainment, etc., etc. Of course, there's the ease of production. For a podcast, all you need is a computer, some recording and editing equipment and software, and a podcast host company, and you have your own show. Pretty much what I'm doing right now. A talk radio show requires a lot more. There are way more barriers to entry. I will leave it at that. Well, there you have it. A brief history of talk radio with a primer on how radio came to be, from a concept to a reality that paved the way for podcasting today. Thank you, radio. We owe you a debt of gratitude. As always, I will leave links to my research in the show notes. All right. That's all for this episode of Success Before the Internet. I hope you found it enjoyable, informative, and entertaining. Thanks for tuning in. You can find us in any of the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate or review the show. It really goes a long way in getting the show noticed. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com groups Success Before the Internet. Or you can go to our website, successbeforetheinternet.com, to get all our episodes streaming there. You can also email me at successbeforetheinternet@gmail.com with any comments about the show. All the music in the show is from my band Sideshow. Our music can be found on SoundCloud under the name Sideshow Band 72. So until next time, I'm Dan Vespa. And remember, there was success before the internet. We just forgot.